Good morning, everybody. Yes, my title today is The Fashioning of John Keble, and what I want to do in the short time available to us is to suggest that the John Keble of historical memory, of biographical convention and sometimes caricature, is to some degree a late Victorian invention. I want to suggest that there were obvious reasons for late Victorian clergymen to want to venerate a particular version of John Keble. This was central, of course, to the purpose in founding the college whose anniversary we're exploring today. But that ensuing version has obscured important aspects of Keble's mind and personality, his thought, his activism, which I'll unpack shortly. The caricature itself does not, I imagine, need much rehearsing to this audience. Josh has already teed it up. Keble is the son of a rural Gloucestershire clergyman who, in his own lineally dutiful way, served then as a rural Gloucestershire and Hampshire clergyman his entire working life. Keble, the author of The Christian Year, and therefore, by some estimates, the most published romantic poet of the 19th century. Keble, who of the Oxford movement's founding trinity, led not by agitation or thought, as Newman and Pusey did, but by modest personal example, in quietist retreat, and in his personal counsel to the next generation of Anglo-Catholics, a sort of bucolic Yoda to the action men of the Rebel Alliance. I'm glad not to have misjudged this audience and hoping that they would get a Star Wars reference. As Owen Chadwick put it in 1964, himself it should be said, summarising this very caricature, quote, "A simple country curate with no understanding of dissent and little of low churchmen, a writer of poetry, touching but not of the first rank, neither theologian nor evangelist, but a quiet, stable pastor. We expect the lion to roar, and finding him meek and placid, we suffer a twinge of disappointment." Much of the caricature derived from the, I think we can call it, official biography of Keble, which was entrusted to Mr. J.T. Coleridge, who again Josh has introduced, nephew to the poet, undergraduate friend of Keble's at Corpus Christi, and thereafter a lifelong friend. A loyal Anglican of a rather unimaginative stripe, Coleridge sought to portray Keble as modest, unpretentious, and even naive. He read none of Keble's letters to anybody else, and he gave little authentic sense of Keble's intellectual life or his lifelong politico-religious activism. Charlotte Young's prolific writings indirectly helped to entrench the simplified conception of Keble as the paradigmatic rural pastor. It served Geoffrey Faber, himself no friend to the Oxford movement, and writing at the movement's centenary in 1933, to harden this portrait into parody. Faber construing Keble as a sort of clerical simpleton, someone whose, quote, mind was passionately contented with the past, and whose opinions were unalterable, Yoda thereby morphing into a sort of ecclesiastical Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, there were, I would suggest, obvious reasons for Keble's and a succeeding generation of high churchmen to subscribe to this one-dimensional Keble. First-generation Tractarianism had, of course, proved deeply contentious, provoking the notorious odium theologicum of the 1830s and 40s, a bitterly contested religious politics, episcopal censure, royal disapprobation, all, of course, exacerbated by what Keble himself called the thunderbolt of Newman's conversion to Rome in 1845. With Newman thus stigmatised, and with the severe and morbidly ascetic Pusey no charismatic leader, Keble, in practical retreat at Hursley, could be held to represent the movement's pure pastoral soul, in Newman's own words, quote, its true and primary author. Unlike Newman, Pusey, and many in the movement's second rank, not a few of whom, of course, followed Newman to Rome, Keble came from an inherited high church background, which seemed to afford him surer theological moorings than his more febrile brethren. His pastorate seemed a practical realization of the parochial prototypes idealized in Tractarian treatises and fiction. His poetry, its popular purchase, and its obvious genuflections to Wordsworthianism represented an appealing affinity with a major contemporary and indigenous literary culture, allowing what one historian has called the Victorian churching of Romanticism. In short, with Newman and to some extent Pusey demonised, it was necessary to create this Keble, the poet and pastor of the movement, the dutiful son of the church, the parochial hermit, theoretically reticent and averse to disputation, his example diffused not through self-promotion, but the writings of his admirers. A man with, it might be thought, far better claims to sainthood than his most celebrated confederate, John Henry Newman, who even from the grave seeks to grab the limelight from Keble's 150th celebrations by contriving to become a saint next month. Now, this contemporaneously necessary caricature, I want to suggest, distorts Keble's personality. And in the short talk, I want to recover three overlapping aspects of his personality, which I think we've forgotten. The first is, if you like, his academic distinction, his intellect, his early academic prowess, of which we've heard something already, his theological learning, his critical readings of past and present. That takes us, secondly, to the partisan purposes to which he put his mind, the writing, petitioning, essaying and reviewing, the politicking and pamphleteering in which he was long immersed. And if that political activism represents an obvious engagement with the world, which can be lost sight of, so too do we need to recover, thirdly, the social activism. That is, we might nuance the rather emblematic notion of Keble the poet and parson by colouring into it some sense of the quotidian practical concerns which were the stuff of his lived life for 40 years. Firstly then, what I called his academic distinction, his intellect, his early academic prowess, his theological learning, his scholarship. And it's perhaps especially appropriate as an occasion to mark the anniversary of the foundation of an Oxford college in his honour, to begin there. Newman's is regarded as one of the great minds of the 19th century. Pusey was a Regius Professor of Hebrew before he was 30. Here too, therefore, Keble is always in the shade. But we might remember Keble's own contemporary renown, starting with what Owen Chadwick has called, quote, the astonishing prowess of his undergraduate years. Newman, the son of a banker, went to Great Ealing School, in its early 19th century heyday considered the best private school in England. It also produced Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan, Thomas Huxley, Frederick Marryat, George Selwyn, among many others. Pusey, who was the grandson of Viscount Folkestone, went to Eton. Keble was homeschooled by his father and a mix of aunts, and he won a scholarship to Corpus Christi at the age of 14, which was exceptionally young even by the standards of the time. In 1808, as is itself well known, the future Prime Minister Robert Peel, at the age of 21, we might note, gained Oxford's first so-called double first in the schools both of classics and mathematics, and his performance before the examiners became the stuff of legend. Who became the second person to secure a double first? It was John Keble, just over 2 years later, and aged only 18, the age at which, of course, modern undergraduates now arrive. Only a year later, in 1812, he was elected to an open fellowship at Oriel, and this is significant, for Oriel was not just any Oxford college in the early 19th century. It was Oriel which in the 1790s had opened up the fellowships to authentically meritocratic competition by setting candidates 4 days of written and oral examinations, an ordeal which my colleagues here, I imagine, are glad did not survive the early 19th century. But this set a pattern throughout Oxford for open competition and election on intellectual merit, and it established Oriel as indisputably Oxford's intellectually elite college. In the same year as his election, 1812, Keble won the University Prize for the English essay. In the same year, he won the University Prize for the Latin essay. Of course, he's a college tutor at Oriel from 1817 until 1823, when he accepted the first of his livings. So when Newman spoke of Keble as Oxford's first man, it was exactly in this scholarly sense that he meant it. Yet it is not as if his migration from university to parish life marked the end of his scholarly engagement. As well, of course, as his many published sermons, Keble published a scholarly edition of Richard Hooker that was still in use a century later. He wrote a 2-volume life of Bishop Wilson. He wrote a translation of the Psalms, 2 huge volumes on Homer and ancient literature, and a translation of St. Irenaeus. Perhaps in ways that I've suggested, i.e. a willed contradistinction from Newman and Pusey, it was inevitable that this aspect of Keble has been rather relegated. Newman's mind propelled him to Rome. Pusey's mind propelled him to what the modern eye would regard as really authentic psychiatric disturbance. Little wonder, perhaps, that Tractarians sought to emphasize not Keble's mind, but his soul, the force of the exemplary rather than the cerebral. I can't but think that Keble's early academic lustre has duly been lost in the course of his memorialization as gumbooted parson. As I've said, that takes us secondly to the partisan purposes to which he put his mind: the writing, petitioning, essaying, and reviewing, the politicking and pamphleteering in which he was always immersed. Now, Keble's role in delivering the assize sermon, conventionally held to mark the commencement of the Oxford movement in July 1833, is itself very well known. But I would suggest the tendency thereafter has been to marginalise his own direct participation in the movement's polemic and in its organisational mobilisation. The convention really is that Newman and his acolytes launched the pamphlet war and the ecclesiastical politicking central to the church warfare of the 1830s and 1840s, as if delivering centrally on Keble's drive-by outburst of shire outrage. No, especially, of course, in the 1830s and 1840s, but indeed, of course, throughout his life, Keble was an ecclesiastical conspirator and a political agitator. He had cut his teeth in university politics in opposition to Peel's re-election as its MP after the betrayal of Catholic emancipation in 1829. Although he could not attend the so-called Hadley Conference of 1833, in which the nascent movement sought to establish its programme and its tactics, Keble corresponded furiously with Newman in order to shape the agenda and the outcome. In terms of a Tractarian polemical voice, he constantly agitated over the submission of letters and articles to the British magazine. He sought to secure a favourable editor at the Succession, and when that failed, he encouraged Newman in his takeover of the British Critic, which was then to become the Tractarians' house magazine. He wrote anonymous didactic fiction for the Penny Post for many years. Keble's mobilisation in religious politics indeed never tired. He organised petitions against the 1834 marriage bill, which empowered dissenters. He produced 1,000 placards against it for local distribution. Throughout 1835, he, quote, got up a turmoil against the low churchmanship of the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, from which he later very publicly withdrew. He organised circulars to members of Convocation against the proposed abolition of religious tests. He opposed Whig candidates for the chair in political economy at Oxford. He successfully petitioned against the successive proposals emanating from the Ecclesiastical Commission. He led public protests against a Lutheran becoming a godparent to one of Queen Victoria's children. He sought the legal prevention of various nominations to bishoprics. He argued for the legitimate use of the ecclesiastical courts in frustrating the state's legislative agenda. Nor was this an immersion narrowly in ecclesiastical politics. Keble lobbied hard, for example, against the malt tax. Its repeal, he wrote to Newman in 1834, quote, would be an unspeakable good to the poor in many respects. Why not instead tax landed and funded income and trading capital? He orchestrated local protests against the new poor law. He served on diocesan committees on education. His letters to Newman and Pusey, to Isaac Williams, to his brother Thomas at Bisley, to the local squire and MP Sir William Heathcote, to Gladstone, indeed, constantly reflect these preoccupations. The themes of Keble's intellect and his mobilisation on behalf of what he called the firm, are perhaps best realised in the periodical articles, such as those he wrote for the British Critic under Newman's editorship. Indeed, I would argue that the absolutely definitive expression of Tractarian attitudes to the question of establishment is Keble's long and remarkable article in the Critic in 1838, reviewing William Gladstone's book of that year on church-state relations. Given the familiar representation of Keble in Quietist Retreat at Hursley, and due to the anonymity of this periodical writing, this hugely important article was until recently almost literally forgotten, and we've recovered it principally via studies of Gladstone, on whom we know the review made a profound impression. Scholars of Tractarianism now recognise Keble's model of confessional politics, a radical and aggressive conception of establishment, asserting the Church's superiority to the state and the state's consequent duty to it, premised on scripture and antiquity as the classic statement of Tractarian political thought. In his organisational energies and in this political thought, Keble, we should be clear, was a committed and ongoing pugilist and not some counterpoint to Newmanite or Puseyite activism, leading by example in parochial retreat. Thirdly and lastly, I said I wanted briskly to recover some sense not just of the political activism, but of the social activism which it empowered, that we might nuance the situationally convenient figure of Keble the poet and parson by colouring into it some sense of the quotidian practical concerns which were the stuff of his lived life for 40 years. For I would argue that despite the representation of Keble which much hagiography has bequeathed, because perhaps of a poetically derived association of Keble with rural idylls rather than the labouring poor who populated them, and certainly because of very limited reading of Keble's letters, most of them sat unread in the college library for decades, I'm not sure that we yet have a fully realised sense of how Keble actually spent his days. For Keble, the poor were not a Wordsworthian category. He was himself frequently ill from his visitations to the parish sick. While still at Oxford, he'd visited and made detailed notes on the Oxford workhouse, and he had sent alms to the manufacturing poor of Lancashire. From Hursley, he wrote long letters on the states of the harvests, setting out the different ways in which rain affected potatoes, turnips, grain. He established allotments and garden grounds for vegetables and a corn club to allow the poor to buy corn wholesale. He expressed constant concern at bread prices, intervening with magistrates and bakers. He corresponded at length on the optimal treatment for cholera. He lobbied against the so-called truck system of payment in kind. He pressured magistrates to moderate the sentences imposed on local swing rioters and to commute excessive sentences on poachers. He endlessly harried, quote, the gentlemen to show themselves gentlemen by lowering rents. He founded a parish school and immersed himself in its administration, calculations of salaries, syllabus, spending parts of every day in teaching and catechism, and he pressed the farmers to contribute more to it. He established a parish medical society, and he enlisted on the committee of management at Oxford's Radcliffe Infirmary, just next door to us, of course, to improve his understanding. He founded a blanket club for the winters, a parish savings bank, in the hope of encouraging poor parishioners to save during seasonally high wages, and if all else failed, he supported emigration schemes. Isaac Williams was to recall that of all the respects in which he had influenced him, Keble's approach to the poor was the most significant. At Harrow, Williams wrote in his autobiography, quote, as at other public schools, the poor were never spoken of but by some contemptuous term, looked upon as hateful boors to be fought with, or cajoled for political objects. But for them to be looked upon with tender regard and friendship, more than the rich, and in some cases even referred to as instructors of the wisdom which God teaches, this was a new world to me. For Keble, In other words, parish life was not, as so often represented in the literature, a retreat from the world encouraged by the romantic aesthetic, or a retreat from the religious politics of Oxford and London made necessary by his temperament. It was a committed and everyday engagement with the world. It might be added in closing that the Keble I've sought to recover is actually no bad Keble to recover in the context of Keble College's, any college's, educational purpose in the 21st century. The Anglicans who sought to keep the flame of his memory alive 150 years ago could think only in their own ethical context of an all-male Anglican educational institution which might hope to nourish clergy and laymen in Keble's hallowed image. Most Uxbridge colleges, of course, have had to navigate the ensuing transition from confessionalism to pluralism in the last 150 years, and it's a transition to much of which Keble spent his entire life in implacable opposition. But it might be thought that, without too much violence to this Keble that we've glimpsed, fiercely clever, academically decorated, proverbially principled, disdaining all personal ambition and public honour, socially conscious and devoted to the less fortunate, this Keble might be thought to furnish a very serviceable ethos indeed, especially at moments in public life when Oxford's most prominent graduates are not associated with such values.